1877, a mother living in a crowded tenement on New York's Lower East Side faced a problem most Americans will never experience. She had 6 mouths to feed, no refrigerator, no supermarket, and barely 15 cents to spend on dinner. Every loaf mattered, every potato mattered, every bone mattered. Yet families like hers survived, not because they had more food, because they knew how to get more from the food they had. Here is the part nobody talks about. The poorest kitchens in New York developed cooking habits so effective that some are now sold back to us as premium products. One secret turned stale bread into meals that lasted for days. Another stretched a single soup bone into nearly a week's worth of flavor. And pay close attention to number 4 and number 8. Number 4 helped families create abundance from scraps. And number 8 became so valuable that modern restaurants now charge good money for something made almost for free. These secrets were not abandoned because they stopped working. They were abandoned because convenience took over. Today we are uncovering 10 forgotten New York tenement cooking secrets used to feed families on pennies. And by the time we reach number 10, you may discover that the greatest secret was never a recipe at all. It was a way of thinking that helped ordinary people survive when almost everything else was against them. Let's begin with number 1, the bread drawer that never emptied. In a German immigrant household on Orchard Street, stale bread was never considered waste. It was inventory. Each evening, the heels of loaves, leftover rolls, and dry crusts disappeared into a wooden drawer beside the stove. A visitor might have seen scraps. The mother saw 3 future meals. When enough accumulated, she soaked it in milk and mixed it with onions, herbs, and sometimes a single egg. The result became dumplings large enough to feed several people. If milk was scarce, broth did the job. If eggs were expensive, flour helped bind the mixture together. The recipe changed. The principle never did. Nothing useful was discarded. Food historians estimate that bread represented a significant portion of working-class calories during this period. Throwing it away would have been like throwing away wages. Today, restaurants serve artisan bread pudding, rustic stuffing, and old-world dumplings for prices that would have astonished the women who invented them. The irony is difficult to miss. What began as necessity eventually became comfort food, then tradition, then luxury. The stale loaf was not yesterday's mistake. It was tomorrow's meal. And that brings us to number 2, the pot that never seemed to empty. Hester Street. A Jewish mother kept a soup pot on the stove almost every day of the year. A chicken carcass entered the pot on Monday. By Wednesday, the broth was still feeding people. By Friday, new vegetables had been added, along with barley and another splash of water. The pot continued. 1 meal became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 6. Children jokingly called it the endless soup. Adults simply called it supper. This was one of the earliest forms of what historians now describe as perpetual broth. As ingredients were removed, new ones entered. As flavor weakened, another bone appeared. The soup evolved rather than ended. For families living one missed paycheck away from hunger, the system was brilliant. A single chicken purchased on Sunday could flavor meals throughout much of the week. Modern grocery stores now sell bone broth as a premium health product. Yet the mothers of the Lower East Side were producing the same thing generations earlier, not because it was fashionable, because it was efficient. The bone was not dinner, the bone was a week. Number 3, the scraps that became liquid gold. A Calabrian mother living on Mulberry Street kept a small enamel bowl beside her cutting board. Into that bowl went the things most people throw away: onion skins, carrot tops, wilted cabbage leaves, celery ends, potato peels. By themselves, they seemed worthless. Together, they became dinner. Once the bowl was full, everything went into a pot with water. Sometimes a leftover bone joined the mixture, sometimes only salt. Then came the ingredient that cost nothing. The scraps simmered for hours. Slowly, the water absorbed every bit of flavor they still contained. The result was a rich stock that flavored soup, rice, beans, and stews. A single bowl of scraps could improve meals for several days. Today, chefs call this route to stem cooking. Food writers call it zero waste. Menus proudly advertise house-made vegetable stock. The mothers of the Lower East Side simply called it common sense. We're not trying to save the planet. They were trying to save supper. What we call scraps today once carried dinner on their backs. And that brings us to number 4, the flavor jar beside the stove. This is one of the secrets I asked you to remember, because it solved a problem every poor family understood. How do you keep simple food from becoming boring? Neapolitan household near Elizabeth Street A clay crock sat beside the stove year-round. Into that crock went bacon grease, pork drippings, chicken fat, and leftover gravy. Spoonful at a time, day after day, week after week. The jar slowly filled with flavor. A spoonful transformed potatoes. A spoonful improved cabbage. A spoonful turned yesterday's leftovers into something worth eating again. Many Jewish families saved schmaltz, rendered chicken fat. Italian families often saved pork drippings. Irish households treasured bacon grease. Different ingredients, the same strategy. Save the flavor, save the value, save the effort already invested. Today, Americans spend billions of dollars on cooking oils, flavor concentrates, sauces, and prepared seasonings. The women of the tenements quietly produced their own version almost for free. The flavor jar was not leftovers, it was continuity. And that brings us to number 5. The 15-cent dinner that shocked New York. In 1877, a cooking instructor named Juliet Corson published a small booklet with an extraordinary promise. She claimed an entire family could eat dinner for 15 cents. Many people thought she was exaggerating. She was not. Corson visited markets across New York searching for the cheapest, nutritious ingredients she could find. Beans, barley, rice, soup bones, day-old bread, seasonal vegetables. Then she showed working-class families exactly how to combine them. One of her sample menus fed 6 people using ingredients that cost less than many New Yorkers spent on tobacco in a single day. The newspapers took notice, housewives took notice, social reformers took notice. But immigrant mothers probably smiled, because many of them had been doing something similar for years. Corson's real contribution was not inventing frugal cooking. It was proving that frugal cooking required intelligence. Every ingredient served multiple purposes. The broth from lunch became the base for supper. The leftovers from supper became tomorrow's soup. One purchase supported several meals. Nothing stood alone. Everything connected. That is what made the system work. Today, people call this meal planning. Back then, it was simply survival. The 15-cent dinner was not really about food. It was about proving that skill could stretch further than money. Before we continue to number 6, it is worth stepping back for a moment. Because the real secret was never the bread, it was never the broth, and it was never the scraps. Those were only the tools. The real secret was the mindset behind them. Most modern families think about food one meal at a time. The mothers of New York's tenements thought about food 1 week at a time. A loaf was not lunch. It was 3 future meals. Chicken was not dinner. It was soup, sandwiches, broth, and flavor. Potato was not a side dish. It was calories, filler, and insurance against hunger. Every ingredient carried a future. That way of thinking changed everything. When resources are limited, waste becomes expensive. A family earning $10 or $12 a week could not afford careless habits. Every discarded ingredient represented lost labor. Every wasted meal represented lost opportunity. So the kitchen became a classroom. Children learned patience. They learned planning. They learned how to look at an ordinary object and ask a simple question. Can this become? That question eventually extended far beyond food. Families who learned to stretch soup often learned to stretch paychecks. Families who repaired clothing often learned to save money. Families who avoided waste often built stability. The old tenement kitchens were teaching more than cooking. They were teaching resourcefulness, and resourcefulness has always been a form of wealth. Nowhere is that lesson clearer than number 6, the recipe that turned pennies into pounds. One of Juliet Corson's most famous recipes was called rice panada. The name sounded refined. The ingredients were anything but: half a pound of rice, little flour, a small amount of fat, molasses, salt, water. That was nearly the entire recipe. Yet the finished dish weighed several pounds and could feed multiple people. To modern ears, that sounds unbelievable. To 19th century families, it sounded practical. Rice absorbed water, flour increased volume, molasses added flavor and calories. Together, they created something much larger than the original ingredients. This was survival mathematics at its finest. The goal was never to create luxury. The goal was to create enough food, enough energy, enough security to make it through another week. Similar thinking appeared everywhere inside the tenements. Dried beans doubled or tripled in size after soaking, barley thickened soups, oats filled stomachs for pennies. Potatoes stretched nearly every meal. The mothers who managed these kitchens became experts in multiplication. Not mathematical multiplication, food multiplication. How much nourishment can be extracted from a small amount of money? That question guided every purchase, every recipe, every meal. The recipe was not impressive. The mathematics behind it was. And that brings us to number 7. The dumpling that turned leftovers into comfort. In a German household on the Lower East Side, stale bread rarely remained stale for long. Once enough pieces accumulated, they were soaked, mixed, shaped, and transformed. Yesterday's scraps became tomorrow's dumplings. The process varied from family to family. Some added milk, others added onions. A fortunate household might include an egg. A struggling household relied on flour and broth. Whatever ingredients were available, the result was usually the same: a warm, filling meal capable of feeding several people. For children, dumpling night often felt special. For mothers, it felt efficient. The beauty of the dumpling was that it hid its origins. Nobody looked at the finished meal and saw leftovers. They saw dinner. That distinction mattered, because dignity matters, especially in poverty. The women of the tenements were not simply stretching ingredients. They were protecting morale. A family that feels cared for endures hardship differently than a family that feels deprived. The dumpling carried more than calories. It carried comfort. It carried memory. It carried the reassuring message that there would be enough. Today, restaurants across America serve artisan dumplings inspired by old European traditions. Customers happily pay premium prices. Few realize these dishes were originally designed to solve a very simple problem. How do you prevent good food from going to waste? The answer crossed oceans, survived generations, and helped feed thousands of immigrant families. Dumpling was not poverty, it was imagination. And that brings us to number 8. The forgotten stock that modern restaurants turned into luxury. This is the one I asked you to remember. Number 8. The forgotten stock that modern restaurants turned into luxury. If you walk into a fashionable restaurant today, there is a good chance you will find something on the menu that would have seemed completely ordinary inside a New York tenement. Bone broth, house stock, slow-simmered consommé, rich reduction, different names, different prices, the same idea. More than a century ago, immigrant mothers were making these things every week, not because they were following culinary trends. They were trying to feed their families. In a tenement kitchen, a chicken rarely ended its journey at the dinner table. The meat might feed the family on Sunday. The leftovers became sandwiches on Monday. The bones entered a pot. The broth flavored soup on Tuesday. The soup flavored rice on Wednesday. One purchase continued working long after the meal ended. That was the secret. Every ingredient had a second life, sometimes a third, sometimes a fourth. The stock pot sat at the center of this entire system, quietly transforming scraps into value. A handful of vegetables became flavor. A leftover bone became nourishment. A pot of water became opportunity. Today, chefs proudly advertise broths simmered for 12, 24, even 48 hours. Customers pay premium prices. Immigrant mothers were using the same techniques generations earlier. The difference is that they never considered it special. To them, it was simply practical. The stock was not a trend. The stock was a system. And for families living on pennies, that system created the feeling of abundance. Stock pot was not cooking. It was wealth extraction. And that brings us to number 9, the meal that fed a family more than once. One of the most important skills inside New York's tenement kitchens was the ability to see tomorrow while preparing today's dinner. A Sicilian laborer might bring home a small roast on Sunday. His children saw one meal. His wife saw 4. The best portions appeared at dinner. The leftovers became sandwiches for workers heading to factories. The scraps and soup stews. The bones became broth. Nothing stopped after the first meal. Everything continued. One roast could influence meals throughout the week. This was not merely cooking, it was planning. Modern families often talk about meal prep. Tenement families lived it. Every ingredient was expected to contribute as much as possible before leaving the kitchen. A meal was never just a meal. It was a chain of future meals waiting to happen. That habit did more than save money. It reduced fear. Because families who could stretch food further worried less when work became uncertain. The meal was not dinner, a strategy. Before we move to number 10, there's one final piece of this story. Because something happened as America became wealthier. The food improved, the appliances improved, the convenience improved. But many of these skills quietly disappeared. Little by little, generation by generation, the tools remained, the wisdom faded. And that may be the most important lesson hidden inside these old kitchens. The mothers who lived in New York's tenements were not experts because they possessed more resources. They were experts because they respected the resources they had. They looked at food differently. A stale loaf was not waste, a bone was not finished, a scrap was not useless. Value existed everywhere, if you knew how to find it. That mindset eventually spread beyond the kitchen. Families that learned to stretch food often learned to stretch money. Families that learned patience often learned stability. Families that learned stewardship often built security. The kids reinforced one another. The kitchen became a training ground for resilience. And that brings us to number 10. The kitchen that wasted nothing. If there was one secret connecting every item on this list, it was this. Nothing was wasted. Not the bread, not the broth, not the scraps, not the drippings, not the leftovers. Everything mattered. Everything had value. Everything had another purpose waiting to be discovered. The truth is, there was never a magical recipe hidden inside New York's tenements. The real secret was a way of thinking, of seeing possibility where others saw limitation, a way of finding abundance inside scarcity. The mothers who ran these kitchens rarely considered themselves extraordinary. They were simply doing what responsible families have always done, taking care of what they had, preparing certainty, looking after the people they loved. Yet those ordinary actions produced extraordinary results. They fed families through economic hardship. They carried children through difficult winters. They helped immigrant households survive long enough to build better futures. History often celebrates great inventions, great leaders, great events. But history is also shaped by small daily habits: a woman saving bread, a grandmother stirring soup, a father carrying leftovers to work. Tiny actions, repeated thousands of times, quietly changing lives. Today, many people look back at these old kitchen traditions and see nostalgia, something charming, something old-fashioned. But the people who lived them saw something different. They saw survival, they saw security, they saw responsibility. And perhaps that is why these forgotten cooking secrets still resonate today. Not because we want to live exactly as they did, but because we recognize the wisdom behind their choices. The understanding that security often begins with taking care of what is already in front of us. The greatest secret hidden inside New York's tenement kitchens was never how little people had. It was how much they could do with it. Bread drawer was not storage. It was planning. The bone was not dinner. It was a week. The stock pot was not cooking. It was insurance. The flavor jar was not leftovers. It was continuity. And the kitchen itself was not simply a place to prepare food. It was a school of resilience. If this story reminded you of something your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents used to do, share it in the comments, because sometimes the oldest wisdom survives only when someone remembers to tell the story. And sometimes the smallest kitchen lesson carries the largest truth. The old kitchen was never just a kitchen. It was a way of life.